we've definitely got nerfs on the way to Marvel Snap. A week ago, Ben Brode teased that Galactus was on the watch list for balance changes. We haven't seen a patch. I've been waiting all week. And then earlier today, we also got another Second Dinner developer saying that Leader is on the watch list as well. So 2 cards here that have been teased for nerfs. And if they're being openly teased like this, that pretty much means they're going to be changed in one way or another. But I suspect that the changes wouldn't stop there. Most of the balance passes we've seen in Marvel Snap have included quite a handful of cards. I think there are some others that stand out at the top of the meta that are very likely to get an adjustment, whether small or large. I wanted to predict and identify some of the meta outliers, I think, currently that are most likely to be nerfed. Now, do keep in mind, I'm not suggesting these changes. I'm just pointing out the cards that are most likely to get an adjustment. I actually think the meta's in a pretty decent spot right now. I would change Leader if I had to change anything else, but most of the cards in this video, I don't necessarily think need changed. They just might be. So let's kick it off with a prime example. Galactus was the first card teased for balance changes there by Ben Brode. This creates some moments where the game really just boils down to whether that Galactus connects or not. And then if it does, the person playing Galactus can theoretically just win that single location, maybe deny their opponent's game plans in other locations and just stack crazy stats, whether that's via null or death, or maybe just a Shang-Chi to react, Valkyrie to reset stats. There's a handful of ways to do that. And apparently Marvel Snap team thinks that's a problematic play pattern in one way or another. My experience playing Galactus is not that similar, and my experience playing against Galactus also does not demand a balance change. I think often decks telegraph this play pretty hard because they have to leave that lane open, and there are a handful of different ways to disrupt this before it happens. So sending over a green goblin so they can't use that lane, using an arrow to pull Galactus into an occupied location. It's pretty easy to counter this, and then sometimes it's actually possible to just go toe-to-toe with it and beat it even when it connects, because you might have big stats yourself. Not even a crazy great win rate as far as I can tell. Not a great cube gain rate. Really surprised to see Galactus on here. Now, how would they change Galactus? I have no idea. I've seen people suggesting changes like this one, where Galactus goes off next turn to give your opponent a little bit more of a heads up. I think it's also pretty likely they just lower the stats on Galactus, maybe make him like a 6-0 or something, so that it's a little bit harder to get some power stacked up in that location. That would be a pretty minimal change, but I don't think Galactus needs much of a change. So curious if you guys would both change Galactus, number one, and how you would go about doing it. Do you think it needs a mechanical change, or can there be some sort of stat change that does enough for Galactus? I'm very, very curious to hear. So the other card teased here was Leader, and this card has been very divisive across the community. A lot of people complaining about Leader, myself included, a handful of other folks out there defending Leader, and really I think it comes down to which kind of deck you like to play. If you play a more tempo-oriented deck, or you're getting it power down early in the game, you probably think Leader sucks. It's like, oh yeah, I already got all my cards out. Leader is doing nothing. If you play a deck that relies on a big turn 6 swing, you might think Leader is pretty oppressive because you're trying to dump all your stats in the final turn, and Leader just gets to copy them. And there's some middle ground too, with certain synergistic decks that can deny Leader more easily. Certain counters like Destroyer, for instance, can help you wipe out an opponent's board with Leader. So this card lives in this really weird space where some people think it's busted, other people don't. Apparently Marvel Snap team is leaning on the side that it needs a change in one way or another. They've teased that it's on the watch list. I would say this: regardless of where you stand, Leader is a very popular card, especially at higher ranks. There are so many different decks. The Leech Leader Dara deck in particular, Dara, the person who made it, that deck has been everywhere at the top of the ladder over the last week or so. It's kind of tapering off a little now, but certainly it peaked at a pretty crazy play rate. So if a card's getting played that much, that is certainly an indication of its strength in one way or another. Whether it's hurting you or not, whether you think it's easily countered or not, it still got played a ton, and that alone might be reason enough for Marvel Snap to want to lower the power level on this one. It also just creates bad feelings, frustration, lack of agency. Sometimes it feels like when you're playing against Leader. All of those things are things that Marvel Snap team probably wants to change. I have no idea how they're going to tackle this one. I personally think a fairly small stat change would actually be enough to pull leader down. I don't think it needs a mechanical change necessarily. Like if you make this a 6-2 or a 6-1, I've even seen 6-0 thrown around as well, that will make a big difference. There are a lot of scenarios where sometimes that 4 power on the leader is needed to swing a location in your favor, like you're down by 3 in that location, and you need the leader to get you over the hump to make sure that your matching stats from the leader are enough to actually take the win. So that would be my recommendation if we're going to change leader. I don't think it needs a mechanical change necessarily, but they might anyway, because a lot of people are expressing so much frustration with this card. Again, very curious where you guys land on the leader needs a nerf spectrum. There are opinions all across that spectrum, and they're often very heated as well, I've found. All right, so moving on here, I want to take a look at some cards that have not been mentioned, but I think are still pretty likely targets for nerfs in one way or another. Again, these are just my guesses. We have no idea if these are actually going to be balance changes, just predictions for me. But Silver Surfer is showing up in a handful of high tier decks. There are a couple different ways to build around and support Silver Surfer, namely Mr. Negative decks can use this to great success, flipping it to a 0-3 along with lots of other really nicely fitting 3-drops in Mr. Negative decks like Mystique, for instance, Ironheart. Those all fit in great anyway, and then Silver Surfer just doubles down on those 3-cost cards. Beyond that, we also have a handful of different ways to play it with Sarah decks, where you're discounting to play multiple 3-drops on your final turn. So Sarah on 5, and playing 3-cost cards each for 2 mana on turn 6. That can also be a pretty powerful spike as well. At the end of the day, it's just that Silver Surfer can often pump out 9, 12, 15, even more power on a single 3-cost card, and that is a really big rate of return. It's also happening in a way that's surprising, that can move across locations, and, you know, for instance, playing a Brood into a Storm location, suddenly you can dump, you know, 12 stats in a location that's closed off. That sort of flexibility to play into closed locations, that total power output, are both just really ridiculous for a 3-cost card. So I do think they might go ahead and push Silver Surfer down to +2 power instead of +3. That does lose, you know, a nice little numerical symmetry there with all the 3s, but I think the total output on this card is just too high. Frankly, at +2 might still be a pretty good card. This also makes it feel more in line with something like Spectrum, for instance. Yeah, Spectrum has some base stats, but the fact that Spectrum only buffs 2, Silver Surfer buffs 3, that always felt a little weird. Yes, again, you know, 3 is a tighter restriction than ongoing cards, but still, it just felt like a mismatch in my brain. So +2 might be an outcome here for Silver Surfer. I don't think they'd want to push this to 4. That would feel even weirder. Maybe if they go to +2, they give this a stat or 2, like make it a 3-2, a 3-1 or something to help balance that change out a little bit. But I do think this card will probably see a change. So next up we have Death, and this card's been good for a really long time, basically since the release of Wave in the early access period. Being able to discount Death to 0 energy often on your final turn and playing that alongside another really big threat, often dumping like 24 power on your final turn along with other abilities, that has been a really reliable recipe for success in Marvel Snap. And now with the addition of things like Galactus, it's making Death even better in these other varieties of decks as well. Just seems like a card that has a lot of utility. Going to 0 is a very powerful thing, and 12 is a really high power total for that. So wouldn't be shocked at all if Marvel Snap team took a couple stat points here off of Death, made it a 9-10. That's still really big, still really swingy, still offers a lot of utility for Death. Just, you know, prevents it from going toe-to-toe with other very powerful 6-drops straight up. Things like Magneto, for instance. Death can't just match those 1-to-1, which could be an important breakpoint difference. I'll be honest, I don't think Death is like too powerful in the scheme of things these days. This is not a change I'm personally clamoring for. I don't think Death desperately needs a change or anything. Just feels like the kind of card that's been so good for so long, still showing up in a lot of high tier decks. Feels like a target, even if it's one I don't certainly care for too much. So next up here is Aero, and man, this is a really good card. I think there's a lot of arguments that Aero is actually the best card in Marvel Snap. This shows up in so many different decks because it does two things. Number one, it has a really nice power for its cost. 5.8 is a good stat line. It's not like, you know, the best possible stat line, of course, but it's really solid. That can just go straight up and just dump a bunch of power, and you're happy sometimes just to get that 8 power. That feels good enough. But then, of course, the on-reveal effect for Aero is just so incredibly disruptive. It can both screw with your opponent's plan, breaking combos, denying them from playing something into Wong on a key turn, or moving their Galactus like we talked about earlier so that it doesn't activate. And then, of course, you also have this power from Aero where on the final turn, you can just pull your opponent's stuff to a location that you're already losing. And as long as you're winning those other 2 spots, Aero can almost guarantee you a win in a lot of cases. Depending on the deck, of course, they could have Dr. Doom stuff. But very often you can just guarantee you're going to win because your opponent plays a card or 2, Aero pulls them into the wrong spot, and boom, the game is over because of the utility of her effect. And because of that, I think Aero is actually one of the most likely cards to get nerfed. I'm actually surprised it hasn't yet, because it's been good and really good for a while now. All kinds of different decks are able to squeeze this in and make it work. So actually a really easy change for Aero is to make it a 5/6, and the reason I say that is because Aero used to be a 5/6. It actually got buffed to a 5/8, and that's basically when it became one of the best cards in Marvel Snap. So maybe they would split the difference and make it a 5/7, but they might just revert Aero to 5/6. I think Aero would still be a pretty solid card at 5/6. Still has that utility we talked about to save games on turn 6. Sometimes still has a ton of disruption potential. And, you know, 5/6 isn't a great stat line, but it's not absolutely abysmal either. So whether 5/7 or a 5/6, I definitely think Aero is a card that is very, very likely to get changed. And then finally, I just wanted to throw this out there. I don't actually think these 3 cards are going to get changed, and I don't think they should be changed. I would be really sad if these cards got nerfed, but I will say these are very commonly the 3 most popular cards in Marvel Snap. They show up in all kinds of decks. They are clearly quite powerful, each of them offering different kinds of answers. They're sort of tech cards, but frankly, they just offer so much utility that they feel like staples. They just feel like really good building blocks that cause disruption, great super efficient removal, big swings, and so on. And, you know, sometimes when cards are getting played that much, developers and designers look and go, yeah, maybe we ought to pull the power level back on these. Could you make Cosmo a 3/2? Could you make Killmonger a 3/2? Could you make Shang-Chi a 4/2? Yeah, they would still be good cards, frankly. So I don't think these need it. I like these existing. I think these are important cards for people to have, particularly earlier in a collection level, to make sure they have answers to various things in the meta, to make sure that these counters exist and are available to everyone. That's great. I hope these don't get changed, but I would say don't be totally shocked if one or more of these 3 cards does end up showing up on a balance change list. Let's hope they don't, but they absolutely might. And yeah, there you go. Those are my predictions for potential nerf targets in Marvel Snap. There were a few other cards I almost included on this list, things like Bast and Wave, probably a couple more, but for one reason or another, I decided they probably weren't the most likely targets. But I am very curious. We don't have a lot of history here for what kinds of cards get changed, and the design and balance philosophy for the Marvel Snap team. Still a pretty new game, so we're going to learn more and more about how they're thinking about the game and what they're looking to change with each new balance patch. That said, I'm very curious when this balance patch is actually going to land. Clearly it's still top of mind for them, and very excited to see what changes actually happen. So what do you guys think it's going to be? When is it going to be? I want to hear all those thoughts and more in the comments below. But until then, thanks much for watching, and until next time, game on.